Hello everyone. Before I begin, I want to tell you that this video is not a concise list or quick breakdown of some of Azeroth's creepier locations, and is instead more of a long-winded personal story of my own exploration and experiences. If that's not your kind of thing and you'd rather get a more tidy and informative experience, I can recommend these videos here. They're all great. But to those who wish to stick around, grab a drink, turn down the lights, and get comfortable as we journey into the uncanny plains, hollow facades, and haunted depths of Azeroth. I've spoken many times about my lengthy history with the horror genre on this channel before. While it may have only become a big part of my life in the late 2000s and early 2010s, my fascination with the dark and unsettling has been there since long before I could even read. One of my earliest memories when it comes to gaming is sitting and watching my mother play one of the Silent Hill games, and I vividly remember thinking, this is cool as fuck. Or at least, something to that effect. And the rest of my childhood was a strange, but to me, wonderful mix of regular childhood stuff and weirdly morbid media. For every film I grew up with, like Toy Story, Cats and Dogs, and Home Alone, I remember others like The Blair Witch Project, The Ring, and 28 Days Later just as clearly, and just as fondly. I was a weird kid, alright, I make YouTube videos now, what did you expect? But this morbid fascination didn't extend very far into video games, though not for a lack of trying. There just weren't that many available to a kid that had a PS2 and multiple brothers who didn't care for horror competing with me when it came to game purchases. I took what I could get though, and let me tell you, I was resourceful. From pretending to be a slasher villain in Vice City to stalking the woods of San Andreas looking for cryptids, and replaying the first and third level of Timesplitters 2 over and over again because they were somewhat horror-themed, I had a blast. Yes, I also had access to multiple GTA games as a young child, and yes, I'm fine. The near infinite access to short-form video that kids have today is way more harmful than the occasional digital cleaver massacre. And every so often, I'd get on the family PC and play some point-and-click flash horror games, but that was never enough to really quench the thirst for spookiness that I had. But horror isn't the only thing that's always been a part of my life. While I definitely got that from my mother, I got something else from my brothers. Warcraft. The first game I remember my family buying in a shop was Warcraft 3, The Frozen Throne. I remember me and my brothers piling into the back seats of my dad's car and all clutching the box, examining every little detail as we speculated what this thing could hold for us. I recall looking at the white-haired man with the cruel grin on the cover and asking my brothers in a moment of pure speculation, "Is that Arthas?" One immediately responded without a scrap of hesitation or mercy, "No, idiot, Arthas is a good guy." Ladies and gentlemen, that was Arthas. And Arthas was not a good guy. I don't know how my brothers didn't know that, as he turns evil pretty early into Warcraft 3's base game, so by the time of the Frozen Throne, they should have already known this. At least I had the excuse of being the youngest and shittest at the game. I should probably mention that this early formative memory is also one of incredibly early spite, but anyway, the point is, Warcraft has always been around me, and of course, that includes the titanic entity, World of Warcraft, a game that is still going to this day 20 years later, that recently added a very fun Battle Royale mode. What a life. Now, my memories of the early years of World of Warcraft are foggy, to say the least. Lots of watching my brothers play on our shared account because, well, you try talking your mother into paying for more than one monthly subscription for an MMO in 2005. A subscription back then was something you did for magazines and other physical products, not access to a video game you already bought. And MMO just sounded like someone fucking up the alphabet, which I wouldn't put past my brothers who couldn't identify this guy as Arthas Menethil. My main memories from this time come from watching my brother do this weird thing called raiding on his dwarf rogue, in places called shit like Milton Keynes and Anchorage and fucking Next Christmas. He even let me take control of his little rogue fella when he was in that last place. We just stood around in a big hallway with some zombies and whatnot, while a bunch of people sat around eating and drinking. And when I played on my own characters, the combat was a bit complex for me. My buttons would sometimes disappear off my bars for no reason when I used them. I kept making new characters when that happened because I thought the others were just doomed. I don't think I ever made it past level 12 or 13 for any of the dozens of characters I made until well into the game's second expansion, which, for the non-World of Warcraft players watching, is really quite poor, but what I lacked in gameplay knowledge and questing ability, I made up for in exploration. I still remember the place that sparked what would become my love for World of Warcraft. In the Valley of Trials area, the starting zone for orc characters, there's a secret little path you can take through some hills that leads you into the Barrens, a huge zone of savannas, oases, lions, dinosaurs, bugs, centaurs, and a goblin town that could send you across the ocean to another continent. Ignore for now that the hidden path is labelled Hidden Path and is in no way hidden, because to me, it was. The discovery of that little hidden path opened up a whole world of possibilities and did something unexpected. It scratched the same itch that I got from horror. It was like I was seeing something I shouldn't. I'd stumbled upon something secret, something that led to danger and the unknown. That may sound stupid, but here I am, nearly 20 years and 9 expansions later, and I still love it. Though, I did skip Battle for Azeroth and Shadowlands, so I think I have a better opinion of World of Warcraft right now than a lot of people, but anyway. Let me show you some of what I've found. The map of Azeroth has changed pretty dramatically over the years. For example, at the game's launch, this is what the world looked like. The areas highlighted were completely inaccessible, with only one of them being given a name: Hyjal, in the north of the continent of Kalimdor. Hyjal was well known by Warcraft 3 fans as it was where the base game had its dramatic conclusion, and we knew that Blizzard was likely saving its implementation for something special. Though intrepid explorers were able to break into Hyjal via the often forgotten Winter Spring, a zone so forgettable that it's often overshadowed by Kalimdor's other forgettable zones like the widely disliked Desolus, the empty Silithus, and the weird corridor that is the original Stone Talon Mountains. And those intrepid explorers discovered a largely complete, albeit content-empty zone, with some very cool stuff like the enormous skeletal corpse of the Demon Lord Archimonde, which was never included in any officially released content as far as I know. They made this and they never used it! But every other area highlighted on this map wasn't labelled. The areas either side of Searing Gorge and Burning Steppes were completely unused and eventually removed entirely with the release of Cataclysm in 2010, the land they used to contain now being replaced by smouldering cliffs and ocean. Similarly, the thin stretch of land, which looks like this in the original release, was later updated in Cataclysm to become the Twilight Highlands. A fucking huge place. We knew this little peninsula was Gilneas, and it's where we locked away the furries until we realised the scalies were more of a pressing matter. And this area up here was actually the first to be changed, eventually becoming the Eversong Woods, Ghostlands, and Isle of Quel'Danas, the component parts of the High Elven lands of Quel'Thalas. These opened up in the first expansion, the Burning Crusade, when it was sadly revealed that the High Elves survived despite my best efforts in Warcraft 3. Good God. I can't stand elves, man. Oh, we're smarter and prettier and more dexterous and wealthier and better spoken than you. We also live for thousands of years and are inherently empowered with magic. Fuck off. All that and you got beat by an emo and his team of spiders. You know what, maybe Arthas isn't a bad guy. Anyway, this zone was revealed to be the kingdom of Quel'Thalas and all questions were answered. Except for this. Now, just below this mysterious area is the large dungeon city of Strathome, a place where someone may or may not have done some bad shit. You'd be forgiven for thinking that this area on the map simply represents the city's boundaries, much like the raid of Ankiraj does in the later versions of Kalimdor. However, this is not the case. While it's not accessible by any obvious means, there are ways we can take a closer look. The first way is potentially the most tedious, just swim to its northern shores and take a look. Now's a good time to mention that I'm recording on 2 different versions of the game. The most recent expansion for World of Warcraft, Dragonflight, and also the current Season of Discovery for WoW Classic. So in essence, I can explore the newest versions as well as some of the oldest versions of the world at the same time. In Season of Discovery, I'm afraid to say I'm playing a disgusting, filthy magic user, and I do apologize for that. You guys know that I'm a connoisseur of the human warrior, and not in the way some of you might think. But in classic World of Warcraft, everything takes between 3 and 5 business days, and you can kind of skip around a lot of that by playing a mage. I don't want people to know that I was playing a mage, so I used a different username. Meet Painticus. So in Season of Discovery, I stumble down the cliffs behind the bustling hotspot of the Scarlet Monastery, and I start swimming. One thing you'll notice is that the draw distance on older versions of the game is not great. For example, I'm not that far from the place I'm going to, and it still hasn't popped up yet. but in Dragonflight, I can see it poking up from the Scarlet Monastery itself. When you reach this area in Classic WoW, you're still firmly within the Eastern Plagueland zone, despite being some distance from it at that point. And you can just sort of run around this entirely unused area. There's an elf tower, an elf dock that leads to the scariest ocean cliff in history, and that's about it. Not much to say other than, hey, there's a cool little bit of unused land here that points towards the existence of the, as of then, unplayable High Elves. But if you go there on Retail WoW, in which, thankfully, you can largely fly around in rather than having to run or swim, there are two notable differences. The first is this strange purple sphere that surrounds it. From what I can tell, this is from an unused part of a questline from late into the Legion expansion, but it wasn't implemented until the Shadowlands expansion several years later. Which means, in this zone they've never used, they decided to change it with a fairly unique visual effect 14 years after release, but only properly implementing that change 16 years after release. For no reason. And this isn't the only thing they've changed about this completely unused area. As I mentioned, in Classic WoW you're still counted as being within the Eastern Plaguelands area, but in Retail, you enter a zone called Quel'Thalas. You may think, that makes sense, didn't they add in Quel'Thalas in the Burning Crusade? But no, they didn't. They added in the lower region of Quel'Thalas, sure, but in the form of 3 distinct zones: the Ghostlands, Eversong Woods, and the Isle of Quel'Danas. The name Quel'Thalas is not used anywhere on a map for the actual region of Quel'Thalas, but it does appear here, at a lone tower, unused and forgotten. It even has its own zone chat where you can talk with anyone else in the vicinity. It's a little quiet. I wouldn't be surprised if they give it a purpose in a later update for Season of Discovery, as they've done something similar for another hidden coastal area, Newman's Landing, which is only slightly less obscure. If you're wondering who has enough disrespect for their own time to actively and slowly swim around an entire continent looking for hidden zones, you can stop wondering. I wholly recommend this to Fear and Hunger 1 fans, you'll love it. But as of now, the Quel'Thalas Tower is something they've not only included in the game for 2 decades, but something they've actively updated, despite it having no use whatsoever. Now, some of you at this point may be wondering what I meant by the title of this video being The Haunted Facades and Liminal Spaces of Azeroth, as there isn't much in the way of haunting or liminality going on, but buckle in, I'm about to put my incredibly employable film degree to use. Bear with me. In philosophy, there's a concept called ontology. A lot of you will be familiar and will probably hate this word because it appears in 80% of all academic papers ever, but for those who don't know, it's basically the study of things that exist. It's a little more complex than that, but the full definition is a classic academic version of a chaff grenade. I don't understand what half of the Wikipedia page means because philosophers just love making their field as inaccessible as possible. For people that study the very concept of thinking, you'd think they'd be able to explain their thoughts clearly, but never mind. Ontology is largely irrelevant here, but the reason I bring it up is because of its much cooler younger brother, hauntology. If ontology is the study of things that are there, hauntology is the study of things that are not, but that still have an impact. More specifically, it refers to elements of the past or expectations from long ago that failed to manifest as hoped or were corrupted along the way. It's often associated with phrases like the failure of the future and what could have been. And I fucking love this field of study. There's not really much out there on it, and that's a shame. It's the topic I chose for my dissertation in my last year of university, and I don't want to brag, but I got an A-. But the concept of hauntology is the basis of so much dark media out there. Not just horror, but almost anything dystopian, apocalyptic, and really anything else that is bitter or satirical. For example, Fallout. The entire Fallout franchise, while not being super dark in tone, is incredibly dark in concept. It plays on the complete failure of the idealized American utopia of the mid-20th century. Almost anything based on evil technology, haunted VHS tapes, cursed broadcasts, sentient AI, is all based on the fact that new technologies are time and time again made with the promise to improve our lives, and yet they consistently come with huge drawbacks. And the most famous and well-recognized examples of hauntological media come in the form of music, like The Caretakers' Everywhere at the End of Time. This music that once represented the joy of a ballroom has warped with time and has become the soundtrack to millions of uncanny images and liminal spaces. But why? Why is it distressing? Because it's the echo of a dead way of life. Without the joy it once inspired, it would not sound as mournful as it does now. So, how does this relate in any way to World of Warcraft? Well, this is a tower that provided a glimpse into what Blizzard could do with this zone. Instead, they created the Ghostlands and Eversong Woods and so on, and the world continued developing in a different direction, but this remains. It's still accessible. It's still providing that glimpse into what could have been. It's a dormant ghost of the past that Blizzard seems to poke every so often. And while not scary or necessarily unsettling, it's certainly evocative of some strange feeling. The conscious choice to keep it here, despite how easy it would be to remove without any repercussions, is a unique kind of thing. But it's far from the only one in Azeroth. And believe me, they get weirder. So, that covers the haunted aspect of the title, but what about the liminal space part? Well, for that, we have to get a little more creative with our exploration. That tower area is just one small slice of the larger Quel'Thalas zone. To see the rest, you have to break past some invisible walls and no-fly zones. Unfortunately, I can't find a good way to access it on Classic WoW, but in retail there are a few ways, despite the inability to fly anywhere near this place due to enormous invisible barriers. You could scale some cliffs, trying to find a weak spot in the invisible walls. You could execute some tricky jumps and attempt to break in the old-fashioned way. You could go to a private server and do some shit Blizzard really wouldn't like. Oh mate, you can be a warrior. I don't know why the heroic leap ability can just ignore barriers, but I sincerely hope they never change it. Once we're past those walls, we can explore this place and, well, just take a look. Normally when you break out of a game's bounds or go into some kind of developer area, it feels like you're entering a weird liminal or unnatural space anyway. I still remember the first games I ever did anything like this with, those being the Ratchet & Clank games with their hidden, non-canon friendly Insomniac museum sections, which were fun little behind-the-scenes areas for the more creative of the game's explorers. And in any other game, it feels like you're dissecting it. But in an MMO, it feels different. Because this is a living world which is actively being experienced by thousands of people, and while they're going about their business in these grand open areas chock full of content and things to see, you're in this strange, featureless place that nobody was meant to see. Like, slow. With an MMO, it's not a dissection, it's a vivisection. So yes, I'd count this as a liminal space. Also, MMOs in general feel very strange, even inbounds when there's nobody else around. Lots of NPCs and vendors and enemies just kind of existing, waiting for players that may never come. I predominantly played on the EU realm Mazragos up until 2016 or so I got a lot of that feeling. That was a dead fucking realm, which is a huge surprise because all of the game's realms are named after big people or places in the game's lore, and Mazragos is one of the biggest. Remember him? One of the 5 miscellaneous orc warlords you have to kill in a filler mission in Warcraft 3? He's one step below Illidan and Arthas. I stuck around on that realm because, well, it was home. It had my first character on my very own account, and, well, he's still there today. I hope his pets are doing okay. Viper the Raptor will be getting up there in years now, patiently waiting for a player that will, hopefully, come back. Conveniently, right next to Quel'Thalas is the city and in-game dungeon of Strathome. Strathome, as said before, had a bit of a rough patch, and now it's a little worse for wear. In the original release of WoW, Strathome was one of the highest level dungeons, being for characters nearing and at the then level cap of 60. Annoyingly, it's not even accessible until level 40 something, so I can't really explore it on Season of Discovery, as the level cap was dead on 40 as of making this video. And that's really annoying, because you have to traverse 2 level 45 to 50 plus zones to get there, which is substantially less convenient than you can imagine. But at least I can technically enter the Strathome zone and chat to everyone else there. So that's nice. I also may have ended up unjustifiably in a position I would rather not be in due to no fault of my own and zero exploitation or potentially bannable offenses. At least I managed to sneak behind the locked gate, which hides the secret entrance to Strathome, which I still can't fucking get into. However, it's not really the dungeon itself I want to explore, for you see, the dungeon is what you'd imagine from an undead city in an MMO. Zombies, ghouls, ghosts, necromancers and whatnot. But that's what you see if you go through the dungeon portal and enter the instanced version of the zone, meaning a secluded version of the zone for a small group of players, which is how Blizzard stops these areas from being completely trivialized and emptied by enormous numbers of overworld players piling in all at once. If you get around the instance portal, you can see the city of Stratholme as it exists in the overworld, which is much harder than it seems, as in retail, they intentionally block you from flying there with a frankly oversized invisible wall, and they obscure the zone with a layer of smoke to stop you peering in. And again, you could get around these measures with some carefully planned and meticulously executed jumps, maybe some private server funny business, or maybe some in-depth knowledge of the game's weak points and potential exploits. Yeah, you could do that, mate. Or you can just be a warrior. Mate, this game is well easy. And when you get inside, it's very odd. It's got the full layout from the dungeon, but the streets are completely empty, outside of some charred corpses. The area lacks the grim red-orange filter from the dungeon too, and it just feels off. It's so close to being normal, but it's not quite there. Like it's on the cusp of some kind of threshold. Yeah, like that. But far and away the most interesting part of Stratholme in the overworld is this giant untextured flying citadel, which is likely a placeholder model for the legendary raid of Naxxramas. Now, Naxxramas is a raid that was released twice in World of Warcraft. Once in the original World of Warcraft, where next to nobody played it, and again in the expansion Wrath of the Lich King, where almost everyone played it. The original version was accessible from just outside of Stratholme, and it has a model similar but slightly different to the untextured one found here. Interestingly, there's also an inaccessible gate in Stratholme that leads to a raid portal. Raid portals, at least in earlier versions of WoW, were distinguishable from regular dungeon portals because they were green instead of a bluish white. So past the final boss of one of the sections of Stratholme is a raid gate, but this raid gate was never used. Naxxramas was instead accessible through a teleporter outside of Stratholme. You can see that this portal leads to exactly where the untextured version of Naxx sits, so it was likely the intended entrance from the very beginning. Yet, I discovered something odd. Throughout my time exploring on Retail WoW, I've had access to this item here, which is easily accessible by any character and allows you to view things from a distance when the unstoppable powers of the warrior can't go any further. And unfortunately, no such thing exists in Classic WoW, at least for every character. A few days before I published this video, I decided fuck it and leveled up a hunter character. Hunters naturally gain access to this very same ability, and despite leveling in Classic WoW being fucking horrendous, which it just is, I found that this actually played dividends. Not only was I able to break into places such as the mythical Old Ironforge, an area hidden beneath the dwarven capital city, but after some creative use of some cliffs, I got him into a position where he could not only see all the way across the Eastern Kingdoms to Stratholme, but also across Kalimdor to Mount Hyjal, the restricted zone with the giant skeleton I mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, this ability is restricted by my measly level 14 mana, so I couldn't get a good look at Stratholme. It seemed to be cut off by some strange loading zones, and I would only get a short view before being cut off. A normal man would have given up here. A normal man would know that realistically nobody really gives a shit about this, but I am not a normal man. I ran there as a level 14. To those unfamiliar, this is not a good thing to do, but by God, I needed answers. There's a term in World of Warcraft that I'm fond of. Corpse running. This is when you die and inch forward bit by bit every time you are killed by an enemy. It's not a fast way to do things, it's not a fun way to do things, and yes, it's exactly how I did it. All I can say is fuck days effects. If you've never corpse ran in WoW before, here's an incredibly sped up version of the process. But hey, I know there's a lot of Fear and Hunger fans out there. This seems right up your alley. Finally, I get there, or at least near enough, and I take another peek. And it's exactly the same as I saw before, so that was a pointless exercise. But something interesting is that Naxxramas does not appear above Stratholme in Classic World of Warcraft. In fact, most of Stratholme does not appear in the overworld at all. It's cut off, and instead there's just bare terrain. And if you break the camera out of bounds within the instanced version of Stratholme, the floating Naxxramas model isn't there either. Which means this is another example of Blizzard changing something in the overworld that they A, never intended for people to see, and B, had already decided against using. Yet, here it is, to this very day. At some point in the game's development, post-release, they not only implemented the entirety of Stratholme's layout into the overworld in a theoretically inaccessible and unviewable location, but also threw in an untextured model of an iconic raid into a place they didn't ever use it. I can only imagine this happened in Cataclysm when they overhauled most of the original zones to accommodate for the addition of flying, which is not only after Naxxramas' release, but also after its second release where it was relocated to an entirely different continent. If you're confused, so am I. I fucking love this kind of thing though. I could talk for a very long time about the weird things I've found in other dungeons too. Like the fact that Dire Maul, another major dungeon from the original World of Warcraft, makes absolutely no geographical sense compared to the overworld, and it also contains a peculiar set of floating towers out of bounds that appear nowhere else. Or in the old Hillsbrad Foothills dungeon, where you can see a drained lake with floating fish in it. That's pretty cool. Or in the past version of Stratholme that they added, where they reskinned half of the entire Eastern Plaguelands zone, except for some miscellaneous assets in a place that is absurdly out of the way. And there's also people just coexisting with the undead before the player arrives. Their whole conflict is a sham. But that stuff I'm almost certain none of you care about. I'm just fascinated by the way these things are built. What's more interesting is if we go to look at the Naxxramas raid itself. Now, when they re-released the raids during the game's second expansion, they made the original 40-man version inaccessible, which was the case for many years, only becoming re-accessible in the last year if you follow some incredibly obscure steps. And this made Naxxramas something of a status symbol. Everyone and their mother did the 10 or 25-man version in Wrath of the Lich King, as it was the entry-level raid for that expansion, but Naxx was the original or vanilla World of Warcraft's final raid, which less than 1% of players cleared. So naturally, anyone who cleared Naxx in vanilla had this enormous superiority complex over everyone else, and God forbid that person also complete the Sunwell in the Burning Crusade. But remember earlier when I said I took control of my older brother's rogue when he was raiding? Well, I didn't recognize it until many years later, as I didn't see any other raids until well into 2012 or 2013. But when clearing Naxxramas on a massively over-leveled and over-geared character, I recognized it. This was the place that I played in all those years ago with my brother. I was running around these spooky corridors all the way back in 2006 or 2007. Which means I am the peak of World of Warcraft raiders. And it's funny, the history of World of Warcraft has been full of people lying with stories like, "Yeah mate, I did Naxxramas in vanilla, did it 10-man, heroic, playing a Death Knight in it, and I done Sunwell, and the Zoth LFR as well mate. Got the Ashbringer, then did it, it was well shit." Meanwhile, without even knowing it, I genuinely played, albeit only running around, in Naxxramas when it was the most exclusive thing in the game. And I wasn't even old enough to know that you could use letters in maths yet, and I saw the halls that people 5 times my age dreamed of. It seemed so big back then. So many people waiting for the next big challenge, but here I am now able to sweep through it and the next 15 years of content without breaking a sweat. There's something weird about that too. It's so easy to clear the old content now. But I know that for almost every single one of these old raids, there were dozens of hours of strategizing, coordination, grinding, preparation, attunement, and countless deaths for every member of a raid team. And that's what they were, teams. Groups of people working together, having fun, or sometimes just freaking out and hating on each other, but now I can sweep through it like it's nothing, like none of that ever happened. One of my favorite genres of video online is watching guilds in World of Warcraft clear a boss for the first time. The screams over voice comms and the celebrations and jokes are wonderful, but it seems very quiet now. It's not like these things aren't happening anymore, they very much are. In fact, the race to World First is one of the most entertaining things you can watch on Twitch whenever a new raid releases, but I've never been much of a raider myself. I struggle with a lot of the social aspects of MMOs. I've never been great at handling the idea of letting someone, let alone a group of people, down with mistakes. And that always leads to an interesting feeling when killing the final boss of a raid by myself. Me and someone from the past may be hitting the same enemy, but we're not fighting the same boss. I'm very grateful, as silly as it sounds, to have run around in the halls of Naxxramas as a kid. Because now, when I run through this raid, surrounded by the echoes of those who did it when it was relevant and important, I can look back and remember, yeah, I was there too, in a tiny, insignificant way. I didn't help or progress, and I didn't really even understand it, but I was there. And despite having played this game for the better part of 2 decades, there's not many things I can say that for. I don't know why that means a lot to me, but it does. You don't get to choose what memories stick with you, and you definitely don't get to choose which ones will be important to you. I bet if I asked my brother about that time, he wouldn't remember. But I do. And I'll tell him next time I see him. Anyway, when Naxxramas was re-released, it was moved to Northrend. That is to say, it was here, but now it's over there. Despite that, if you break out of bounds within the re-release in Northrend, you'll find yourself in the Eastern Plaguelands once again. You can take the raid out of the Plaguelands, but you cannot take the Plaguelands out of the raid. There's even a whole version of Strathome here too, and you know what? Fuck off, Strathome. There are entirely too many variations of you. What is interesting are these parts you can see within the Naxxramas Plaguelands. For example, this area where you can see that a dev chose the wrong terrain brush, and this entire snowy area that was fabricated for the sole purpose of housing the final boss room. And this area is way larger than it needed to be and contains some weird stuff in it. And I think that's kind of neat. Oh, for fuck's sake, the untextured version of Naxxramas is here too. Within Naxxramas. Why? I mentioned that with my new Hunter character, I could see into Classic WoW's Hyjal area too, and yep, it's more or less what those old exploration videos showed. Archimonde is mad chillin', the tree is a little smaller than it is in retail, which is to be expected, I suppose, for that is how trees function. If you go to the entrance of Hyjal in Winterspring, you'll find it closed off, but behind it, much like we saw in Strathome, is an unused raid entrance. It was likely that they were planning to make the entirety of the Hyjal zone a raid, which would have made it far and away the biggest raid in Classic WoW, rivaled only by Ankiraj, which was so big it was split into 2 raids, a 20-man where you fight tall fellas, and a 40-man where you fight other tall fellas, and then,
You are already dead. Your courage will fail. Your friends will abandon you. Your heart will explode.
And in the Burning Crusade expansion, they finally did it. The zone was turned into a raid, and the entrance in Winterspring was replaced by one on the other side of the continent that warped you back in time to relive the Hyjal mission from Warcraft 3, which is conceptually very cool, but in execution, not. The layout of the raid is nearly identical to Classic WoW's version of Hyjal, which is fun to see. It's also kinda cool to see the aftermath of the Battle of Hyjal, seeing the Horde base annihilated, seeing the human base corrupted, and seeing the Night Elves get off scot-free as per fucking usual. But again, none of this aftermath content was ever actually used in the game. The full release of Hyjal is quite different. A fun thing I found in both Classic Hyjal and the Raid Hyjal was this inclusion of a little plane that's crashed at the highest peak of the mountain. I think that's very fun. Realistically, nobody could ever see this, especially before the raid was released, but it's a nice touch. I like things like this. Blizzard does a lot of that. They get a lot of flack from, well, basically everyone for nearly everything, and a lot of it is well deserved. Some of it really well deserved, but there are 3 things they, or at the very least, the World of Warcraft team, are consistently one of the best, not only game companies, but media companies in general at. And those are cinematics. Holy shit, their cinematics are leagues above almost any other company and have been for a long time. The Warlords of Draenor and Wrath of the Lich King announcement cinematics are still top of the top, and they're 10 and 15 years old respectively. Music. Time and time again, Blizzard knocks it out of the park with music. All of the music, well, almost all of the music used in the background of this video has been World of Warcraft or Warcraft 3 music. And the last thing they always nail is flavor. I don't know if they have teams of people dedicated to this kind of thing, but every expansion, every zone, every dungeon and raid, they have little things that aren't necessary or really even noticed by most players, but they're there just to add some flavor. And they're fun. Like this little plane. And I think that's very sweet. This area has been a fascination of mine for 14 or 15 years, ever since I first learned about it. Let me take you to the peculiar zone of Deadwind Pass. It's an oddly bleak zone in between Duskwood and the Swamp of Sorrows, and if you're the bleak one when you're next to places effectively called the Scary Woods and Sad Swamp, you know you've got something good going on. From what I can tell, the zone had next to no purpose in the original release of World of Warcraft, outside maybe a handful of quests, if even that. But looming at the bottom of the zone is the foreboding tower of Karazhan. Karazhan is a very special place in World of Warcraft lore, as well as its development history. Spooky Wizard Tower doesn't quite feel like it does it justice, but for all intents and purposes, that's what it is. Like Hyjal and the unused Naxxramas entrance in Strathome, Karazhan holds not 1, not 2, but 3 unused raid entrances in Classic WoW. This is because Karazhan was one of the very first raids ever designed for World of Warcraft, yet it wasn't used until the game's first expansion. It went through multiple changes in its lifetime, with its initial development starting as far back as 2001, a year before even Warcraft 3 was released, let alone World of Warcraft. Early versions of it were quite different. Compare how it looks here to the version found in WoW's alpha, and some versions of it were enormous, like way bigger and more ambitious than any other raid at the time. Eventually, the huge version of it was heavily cut down, removing entire sections the size of regular dungeons, until we were left with something akin to what they eventually released in the Burning Crusade, which happened to be one of the most beloved raids in the game's history. One which was so popular, they remade it as a dungeon in the Legion expansion. Despite the zone of Deadwind Pass being more outwardly creepy than most of the rest of the world, the Karazhan raid and dungeon took its tone in a different direction, being a bit more Scooby-Doo fun spooky than actually unsettling. But if you were to venture away from the actual tower, you'll find a graveyard called Morgan's Plot, the gravesite for a few of the lore's biggest names. Behind this graveyard is a staircase that leads down to a locked gate. Behind this gate is one of my favorite places in all of gaming, which just so happens to be one of the most perplexingly implemented areas I've ever come across. And it is absolutely the most unsettling area in Azeroth. The Karazhan Crypt. There have been so many videos and articles written about this place, but none that I've seen truly capture how odd it really is. Let me explain why. It was theorized to be one of the several areas cut from the early versions of the Karazhan raid, alongside the wine cellars and various other sub-levels, yet it's the only one that remains in place, and is also disconnected entirely from the actual tower. If you go into the raid, you will eventually find yourself on this balcony area, which is also visible from the overworld. From here you can look out over Deadwind Pass, but something is off here. The building placement and general geography is just wrong. There's a whole village here which doesn't exist in reality. There's a horrible field with a hanging corpse, which is not only not in the overworld, but also near impossible to see without the Farsight ability, and the jungle of Stranglethorn Vale, which usually towers over the southern stretch of the zone, is substantially smaller, among several other layout changes. But most notably, Morgan's Plot, the church that accompanies it, and the Karazhan Crypt are all completely absent, despite them being easily spotted from the overworld version of the balcony. This is a very strange inconsistency. They may have removed it during development, and that would explain why it's absent in the raid, but then why would it be in the overworld? We end up in a strange chicken and egg scenario where whichever one was developed last should have been made to match the first, but they weren't. You may think, what's the big deal? There's a graveyard and a church missing and a gate that you can't even access. Who cares? Well, the locked gate of the crypt is not where it ends. Behind this gate lies an entire area that is about as big as the game's average dungeon, if not bigger, and it even overshadows the game's smallest raids in scale. And all of it is fully modeled, textured, and even has interactable elements. Keep in mind, Strathome, a dungeon they fully implemented and had from the game's launch, and a city which was incredibly big in the lore, was not fully modeled in the overworld. But this is. So let me walk you through it. You may think that is impossible. There's a gate there. Well, fittingly, if you die, your ghost can pass through and allow you to explore. The first room you enter is called the Well of the Forgotten, and contains little other than a hole in the ground, which we will get to later. From here we can start going down Pauper's Walk, where we can see the bones of both people and seemingly miscellaneous creatures strewn about, while others are lucky enough to have remained inside their coffins. This leads us to an area simply marked as Crypt, an area with a dirt floor which holds many unmarked tombs with interactable doors. There's not much here, but it's certainly unique. There's nothing like this room anywhere else in the game, from what I can tell, and that won't be the last time I say that about something in the crypt. Here we head back up Pauper's Walk to the Well of the Forgotten, and despite it being pitch black, we take the dive down the hole. This leads us to the peak of the Pit of Criminals, an enormous stack of discarded bones above a shallow pool of water. The fall almost kills us, and if it wasn't for those who had died there before, we surely would have met the same fate. From here we can access an area labelled as the Tome of the Unrepentant. Note the spelling error. It won't be the last we see here. After this, we can see the most infamous room of them all. One that in its name alone is ominous, but combined with the reality of it is downright distressing. The Upside Down Sinners, a submerged tomb where an unlucky few have been damned to a horrific fate, being chained in place, their waterlogged bodies preventing them from the freeing grasp of decomposition. What sins could have justified this? And quite how long have they been here? This room is certainly the darkest in Azeroth. Everywhere else that comes close has a touch of that classic Blizzard humor or levity, but not this. Perhaps that's why it was never properly implemented, and yet, it remains here. From this room, there are a few others to explore, but none come close to the notability of the Upside Down Sinners, aside from the final room, which is simply a slope leading down to an unmarked pit, known as the Slough of Despair. The Brits watching will simply know this as Slough. Again, note the spelling error in this area's title. This and the Tome of the Unrepentant are signs that this was a hastily abandoned project, but again, it was kept in the game. Not only fully modeled and textured, but fully named and labeled as well, albeit with some small errors. Another incredibly eerie thing about this zone is its ambience. There is a near constant sound of a heartbeat, mixed with the occasional grinding of stone, dragging of chains, and other ominous sounds. I later came to realize this is the ambience used in several crypts in the game, including one in the Hyjal raid, which I will bet most World of Warcraft players didn't even know existed. But in other zones that use this ambience, there's usually some sound of combat or enemies around to distract you. But not here. It's just you and the crypt. So what has become of this zone? After 20 years, maybe more, if the development timeline of Karazhan is to be followed, how has it changed? Was it removed, refurbished, or used at any point? The answer is a little complex. In the Legion expansion, they added artifact weapons, a type of weapon that was unique to each specialization of each class. Each of these weapons were awarded following a unique quest, and one of the weapons available to warlocks sent you to the Karazhan catacombs. Finally, the lower levels of Karazhan were, in one way or another, accessible. However, you may notice that it looks drastically different to what I showed before. That is because, my friends, there is a difference between the word catacomb and crypt. For this quest, they not only decided to not use the existing crypt area, but they actually created another one. And the original is still there. According to the archived version of the WoW Wiki website, it was made fully inaccessible in patch 2.0, or the release of the Burning Crusade. But this is not true, and as far as I can tell, this has never been true. I don't know why it says that, as even today, you can use the death trick to get inside. Or you can just be a warrior, mate. Heroic leap, yeah? It's base. Though you will now find that the gate that once kept you out has changed, and some new props have been added to the Well of the Forgotten. A wooden barricade blocks you from delving any further into the zone, and the well itself has been blocked. This is because, in the Legion expansion, they allowed warlocks to come into the Well of the Forgotten area and no further for a weapon skin quest. All of this crypt, and they used one room. But the rest is still there. Entirely unchanged. The Karazhan crypt today is near identical to how it was 20 years ago, complete with the spelling errors. And those bodies are still there, chained and intact. However, Legion did other things to the Karazhan crypt. In the dungeon remake of the raid, the same balcony issue stands, despite being implemented a decade later. When remaking the raid, they made the conscious decision to not update the surrounding landscape, despite giving the crypt an actual use. Weirdly, if you go to the Zul'Gurub dungeon/raid, which borders Deadwind Pass, you can peer over the wall and see the zone without Karazhan. In its place is a large smiley face. And yet, even in an unrelated area, the crypt is represented. There is a hole in the world where it would be. But late into the Legion expansion, they allowed you to finally explore the rest of the crypt without exploits, assuming you take the following steps. Find a hidden note in the Legion version of the city Dalaran. Complete a complex grid puzzle in the Wrath of the Lich King raid Ulduar. Complete a strange version of Candy Crush in the classic raid of Ankiraj. Craft, buy, or otherwise obtain the item Shadow Weave Mask and wear it in a specific location in the Cataclysm Zone of Deepholm. Enter the code 1222176597 into a puzzle device in the Dungeon of Nomragan. Complete an untangling puzzle in the Legion Zone of Val'Sharah. Solve a maze in the Mists of Pandaria Zone of the Kunlai Summit, and only then are you allowed to explore the Karazhan crypt and receive a special mount as a reward. Oh mate, you can skip all that and just be a warrior? Move, mate. Granted, if you don't do all of those incredibly obscure puzzles, you don't get the mount, but on the upside, you can still explore the coolest area in the game, and yep, spelling errors are still there. So, they finally gave it a use. Well, kind of, but not really. One room is used for a weapon skin, and it's one small part of a convoluted puzzle which a tiny amount of the community will partake in. It's funny, when I was exploring the crypt, I found a guy who was AFK on top of the pit of criminals. I decided to scare him by turning into a bird and looking at him. He didn't get scared. He said hi, I said hello. He then said congrats, assuming I did the puzzle to get there. I got scared and ran away. I told you, I'm not good at the social elements of the game. I don't know how I feel about these additions to the crypt. They feel wrong. You get two aesthetic rewards that really don't match the feel of the place. It feels like they wanted to finally use it for something, but ended up making those uses use next to none of the actual location, so I don't count them. They feel cheap and unfitting. Every other mysterious location present in the original release of World of Warcraft has either been expanded on or removed. The mysterious locations on the map that I mentioned earlier have all been turned into something or simply taken out of the game. Gilneas, the Twilight Highlands, the Ghostlands, Eversong Woods, the Isle of Quel'Danas, and Hyjal were all eventually added to solve most of the remaining mysteries. Other places in the original game, like the mysterious doors of Uldum at the bottom of Kalimdor, gave way to the enormous zone of Uldum that was introduced in Cataclysm, albeit in a slightly different location. The dragon-guarded and locked zone of Grim Batal that served no purpose was turned into a large dungeon. The mysterious caverns of Time in Tanaris, which were blocked off by bronze dragons and a strange stone, were turned into the game's largest hub for dungeons and raids. The Dark Portal in the Blasted Lands has been put to use not just once, but twice. The Zone of Silithus, which served almost no purpose other than to hold the raid of Ankiraj, was... well, they stabbed it with a giant sword and blew the whole thing up. I always knew they didn't like this zone. And yet, today we have two things that remain unused despite being given little changes and hints of purpose. The Tower in Quel'Thalas and the Karazhan Crypt. So what has caused me to make this video now? Almost all of the information I've shared has been relevant since 2017 or 2018. Well, I'm making this video because of the current World of Warcraft Classic Season of Discovery. The very version of the game I've recorded a lot of this video on. In the presentation Blizzard made when they announced it, they showed one part of a screenshot, and that one screenshot is the entire reason I'm making this. They showed a screenshot of Pauper's Walk. I don't know when they're going to use it. I don't know how much they'll do with it. It could be one small quest for one class that's quick and forgettable, or they could turn the whole thing into a dungeon or even raid, but that's pretty hopeful thinking. And that's exciting, I think, but kind of bittersweet. They may finally use it for something substantial, albeit in a seasonal remake of the original game, but still. Something other than just a reward location for stuff that is more or less completely unrelated to it. And that would be nice. Hell, it may even be in the game right now as I'm uploading this video shortly after the new update to the game. But a little bit of me is sad about it. This is a mystery that's been in my life for 15 years. It's a creepy little secret that sure is well known to those who would care about it, but still feels esoteric. And that time might just be coming to an end. It's something that for the longest time was haunted by the things it could have been, but soon it will just become one of those things, and the others will vanish. I just hope it's a good one. And if anyone from Blizzard ever sees this, please do one thing for me. Don't fix the spelling mistakes. Because I'm a sentimental bastard, and I know Blizzard is sentimental too. It's the nature of a live service game like this to go through huge changes. It's the nature of an MMO that everything is transient in one way or another. Even re-releases of old versions aren't quite the same as playing the original, because now we know what happens. We know what to do. We know how things work. When I go into WoW Classic and I see the doors to Uldum that once inspired so much wonder, I now know that they will one day be a complete zone. If I go to the blocked entrance to Quel'Thalas, I know that it will eventually lead to the Ghostlands. If I see the Dark Portal, I no longer wonder what lies beyond it, because I already know. And soon when I look at the Karazhan Crypt, which I've been obsessed with for 15 years, I won't see the mystery anymore. I will only see what they've finally done with it. And it will no longer be haunted. So that's why I don't want them to fix the spelling errors, because that's a little reminder of the old times. I mentioned that it was my brothers who introduced me to Warcraft. They stopped playing regularly late into Wrath of the Lich King in 2009 or so, and since then it's mostly just been me. It's strange because I still associate the game with them, but they grew up. I grew up. The game grew up. All of us have changed and we can never go back to the way things were. They now know that it was definitely Arthas on the box art of the Frozen Throne. I now know that it was Naxxramas that my brother let me run around in. And the world of Azeroth is totally different to how we all found it 2 decades ago. When it comes to World of Warcraft, Blizzard likes to use the phrase, coming home, when talking about players returning or re-releases of old content. But we can't go home. Not really, because that home no longer exists. Mysteries have been solved, raids have been cleared, goalposts have moved, and we've all grown up. And that's why I'm very sentimental about it, because everything and everyone changes. But it's nice to be reminded of home.